There will inevitably be comments on this video saying that despite what this looks like, I am not here, and that's because, as every German knows, this city simply does not exist. Or at least that was the case for exactly 25 years until the whole conspiracy theory was officially laid to rest in 2019. Or at least that's what they want you to believe. This is, of course, Bielefeld.
Bielefeld does, of course, exist and is surprisingly large, with a population of over 300,000, giving it the unfortunate distinction of being the biggest city in Germany with no S-Bahn services. It's also in the comically named region of East Westphalia. But it really is its supposed non-existence that is, at least for now, the most famous thing about it.
The Bielefeld conspiracy theory began life at a party in 1993 when one of the guests mentioned that they were from Bielefeld. It soon became clear that nobody else there that night had ever been to Bielefeld or knew anyone else from Bielefeld, and one of them declared that, well, Bielefeld doesn't exist. And another guest at that party, a student called Achim Held, took this idea and developed it into a parody conspiracy theory.
At the time, the internet was still very new and was used mainly by scientists and academics. Held was one of the few people who was already using it regularly, and the following year published an essay on Usenet. The original piece still exists and can now be read on the web, but briefly it says that some entity referred to only as they is faking the whole existence of Bielefeld. Anyone who says they've been to Bielefeld is either one of them or has been brainwashed by them. It was, of course, a parody, a joke, but it caught the public imagination, much to Held's own surprise, and for a while it was a running gag. In any conversation in which Bielefeld was mentioned, somebody is sure to say that Bielefeld doesn't exist, or ask, "What is this Bielefeld you speak of?" Even Angela Merkel referenced the conspiracy, so I thought I should go there and see it for myself, at least to prove that it exists. It doesn't look like it, but Bielefeld's history can be traced back to the 13th century, and proof of that can be found here, of all places.
Now you're going to have to trust me because the sun is bright enough that even with a Polaroid filter I can't get through these reflections, but if you look through this glass you should be able to see a kind of an exhibit showing the archaeological history of Bielefeld from about 1300 to the Second World War.
Markings in the road show where the houses used to be before they were destroyed in the war and initially replaced by a parking space until 1999 when the new office block was built. And you might expect me to be upset by this, but in fact, Bielefeld already has a strange mix of architectural styles, but not many from before the late 19th century. This is a city that has always been rebuilding, so all the post-war buildings here don't feel so much like intrusions. Even the fact that St. Nicholas's Church was rebuilt with a 1950s style spire doesn't bother me as much as it normally would. In fact, it looks as if there's even been a deliberate attempt to preserve some reminders of a more recent past. I love the idea that there are people walking around the city whose grandparents had their first date at this cinema, now a cultural centre offering theatre, music, lectures and comedy. Just over the road, those same grandparents might have originally met at this nightclub, which opened in 1930 and is still open for business today. Even better, there are several businesses that have been operating under the same name for centuries, including this jeweller and this manufacturer of high-quality textiles. And it was in fact textiles that made Bielefeld rich, and there are reminders of that fact all over the place. This statue, for example, depicts a linen weaver. And this shopping centre, which was built on the site of the city's first sewing machine factory, has a name that deliberately references the textile industry.
The same is true of the interior decor, but unfortunately I didn't know about this place until I got here, so I didn't have time to get permission to film inside. And there are house rules, so I can't. Sorry.
I probably wouldn't have got permission anyway, but textiles wasn't the only industry here. In about 1705, a certain Johann Georg Cruvel began making tobacco products, and in 1813 the family bought this old house and converted it into a factory. Of course, Bielefeld was heavily bombed in the war, and this is one of the houses that had to be completely rebuilt. But the factory resumed and was still making tobacco products until 1983. Unfortunately, the company didn't respond quickly enough to pipe tobacco going out of fashion, and nowadays the company still exists, but as a specialist tobacco shop. Another big name associated with Bielefeld is Dr. Oetker, a manufacturer of cake mixes, instant desserts and frozen pizzas. The original Dr. Oetker was a scientist, Dr. August Oetker, who in the 1890s started work on making an improved baking powder. He conducted experiments at a bakery that was here in one of the few medieval buildings left in Bielefeld until he perfected his product in 1901. He didn't invent baking powder, he just improved on what was available at the time. He initially manufactured it in the family kitchen until his annoyed wife banished him to the garage. Now, Dr. Oetker is an internationally recognized brand and still has its company headquarters in Bielefeld, with a museum if you're a fan. Bielefeld boasts a concert hall named after Rudolf Oetker, which opened in 1930. Rudolf was the son of the original Dr. Oetker, who enjoyed singing in the school choir. He complained to a friend that there simply weren't any decent venues in Bielefeld, and he wanted to fix that once he'd finished his studies. Sadly, he was killed in action in the First World War, but his mother had this hall built in his memory, and apparently its acoustics are near perfect. There are a few more things to say about Bielefeld's history, but first I'd like to pay a visit to the Park of Human Rights, and in particular this empty plinth with a very simple inscription.
The basic idea behind this is that absolutely everybody, including you, has the right to put themselves on a pedestal.
And if you're hungry, there are a lot of places to eat, including this one. But it's the building itself I'm more interested in. It was built in 1928 for a grocer called Wilhelm Harms, not to be confused with the writer of the same name, and designed by his friend the architect Paul Löwenthal. It is clad in tiles specially made in Meissen, the city famous for its fine porcelain, which was something of an extravagance. The building was supposed to be bigger than this, but the surprise discovery that they were building on sandy soil drove costs up, and so Harms and Löwenthal deleted an entire story from the plans and vented their frustration on a plaque set into the wall. Harms still found enough money to install the latest in avant-garde design elements, neon lighting. This was, remember, for a grocery shop, although it was converted into a restaurant in 2012. But let's now talk geography and have a quick look at a map of the city and ask the question, why does it look like this? Well, Bielefeld is bigger than it used to be, and during the 20th century many nearby towns and villages were incorporated into it. This is the formerly separate town of Braakwede, which became a part of Bielefeld in 1972. Between Bielefeld's historic centre and Braakwede is a hilly ridge called the Teutoburg Forest, and it separated the Ravensberg Basin from the Westphalian Bight, making a natural border. Today, it provides a convenient respite from the concrete jungle that it slices through. But there is a small gap in it, known as the Bielefeld Pass.
This is a gap in the hills which is very useful in the modern era for building roads and railways, but in medieval times it represented a security hole. And how were security holes patched in medieval times? With a castle.
And so, just south of what was then Bielefeld, and guarding this vulnerable pass, the Sparrenburg was built, probably in the 13th century, by the Counts of Ravensberg. As was normal for this kind of castle, it was continually added to over the centuries, with the outer defensive wall being built in the 16th century. It eventually became Westphalia's biggest fortress, but was almost destroyed in the Second World War. Since it was used as an anti-aircraft gun emplacement, it was bombed by the Allies and had to be extensively reconstructed, a process that wasn't completed until 1987. So Bielefeld was strategically important, but as I mentioned before, it was in the industrial age that it really blossomed. That's evident by the fact that clearly old buildings were constantly being replaced by new ones, but most symbolic of the city's sudden growth is its City Hall. The original City Hall had already been extended in 1821, but it wasn't long before it simply couldn't hold the expanding administration. So, in 1902, work started on a new City Hall on the site of an old hospital, and it was opened in 1904. At first glance, you might think that it should be much older than that. It was designed in the Weser Renaissance style, which at the time was already very retro, or as they called it back then, revivalist. Next door is a theatre which opened in the same year and was financed by the Kruvel family. Its design is the much more modern Jugendstil, the German equivalent of Art Nouveau, which was quite an interesting move given that Jugendstil was a kind of rebellion against the revivalist trends of the time, so the two buildings, connected to each other by a walkway, represent a kind of argument about what good architecture should be. Meanwhile, as Bielefeld continued to grow, even the new improved City Hall wasn't enough, so it had to be extended with a more modern building that took 9 years to build, being finally completed in 1988 in a style that is difficult for me to love. Nevertheless, Bielefeld is surprisingly interesting for a city that supposedly doesn't exist. That was a joke that got out of hand. But while it was a joke that everyone knew not to take seriously, it was also, as it turned out, a warning of what the internet could become. Some of the genuine conspiracy theories out there are just as ridiculous as this one. Bielefeld isn't a destination for the average tourist, but it does teach us a valuable lesson. Don't believe everything you read on the internet.
On the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Bielefeld conspiracy, the city offered €1 million to anyone who could prove that it didn't exist. Entries flooded in, and some of them went into great detail involving mathematical logic and even quantum physics. But all of the entries were successfully debunked by scientists at the university and historians at the city archive, and so Achim Held was invited to help the mayor unveil this memorial stone, which marks the death of the Bielefeld conspiracy theory.
Oh, and it should also be mentioned that Bielefeld is the birthplace of German cartoonist Ralf Rute. Bielefeld is an important stop for long-distance trains from Dresden and Berlin to Cologne and the Ruhr region. It also sits at the centre of a regional rail network extending as far as Hanover and Cologne. The Sparrenburg is mostly accessible to people with mobility issues, although I would recommend driving up the hill. There is a decent amount of parking space available.
Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, there's another one down there for you to click on, and let there be no more talk about Bielefeld not existing.